Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about exposure as it relates to photography. Now this video is going to be geared specifically more toward photography beginners. We're not going to talk too much about the nitty-gritty technical details regarding exposure, but we are going to discuss the basics of exposure. So if you're more of an advanced photographer, maybe move on to a different video, but if you are a beginner or you're looking to get some new tips or some updated tips on getting good exposure for your photography, stick around. We might have something good to talk about today. So when it comes to exposure with digital photography or any photography really, what we're referring to and really where the term exposure comes from is the amount of light that either the sensor or the film, which is really where this comes from, how much exposure to light your sensor or film is getting from your camera's settings, and then balancing those settings to make sure that you're getting an appropriate exposure for the image that you're trying to capture. More or less, is your image too bright or too dark? If it's too bright, like unfortunately the background of this particular video seems to be right now, ironically enough, then your image is at least partially overexposed. However, you'll see if I come too close, now my face is showing up as a little underexposed or too dark, right? So these are a couple of real basic examples of exposure, but let's get a little more into it. I'll have a link down in the description for you guys to go and download a cheat sheet for free that can kind of help you understand a little bit more about exposure and some of the tools you have at your disposal for setting your exposure. Now, when it comes to trying to get good exposure for your photos, there are a number of tools that your camera has built right into it that are designed to help you figure out what your best exposure is and also how to achieve that exposure. You'll notice on most cameras, you've got all these dials, and these dials and settings buttons and things like that are usually dedicated to adjusting settings that will impact your exposure. Additionally, your lens has an exposure setting as well. It's called aperture. And basically what that is there is an iris built into the lens which allows more or less light into your sensor depending on how wide open or closed down that iris is. Some lenses, like this one here, have a ring on it that allow you to adjust the aperture manually. A lot of other modern lenses have all of those aperture settings built in digitally into the lens, which you would then adjust using those dials and buttons and things that I was just talking about. Other exposure-related settings that you should be aware of are shutter speed and ISO. Now, if you are shooting on a film camera, ISO is set by what film stock you're using. That is the speed at which your film reacts to light. So a higher ISO number means it is collecting more light faster. Also tends to result in a higher amount of grain. With a digital camera, you can adjust your ISO settings, and again, the higher the number on ISO, the brighter the image, but also often a lot more noise can be introduced into the image as well. We'll talk some more about that shortly. Now, as far as shutter speed goes, shutter speed is the setting that is going to, you guessed it, control the speed at which the shutter opens and closes to allow light into the sensor. The faster the shutter speed, the less light that is allowed in. And a lot of times people will also use shutter speed to impact how much motion blur is captured in an image. The faster the shutter speed, the less motion blur, so you're able to capture very fast moving objects frozen in time. Slower shutter speed often will result in motion trails or motion blur, which can sometimes also be used to create effect. Now, the third exposure setting that can be controlled from your camera is your aperture setting. I mentioned this earlier with the lens. Now, that setting does control how open or closed the iris that's built into whatever lens you're using actually is. So the wider open your aperture, the more light you're letting in, and therefore you're increasing your exposure. More closed down you make that iris or your aperture, the less light you're letting in and the lower your exposure. Now, with aperture, if you are shooting wide open, okay, you are opening that iris up and you are actually reducing the depth of focus. So what's happening is your focal plane is very, very thin when your lens is wide open. And what happens then, that's how you achieve those photos where someone's face, for example, might be in very, very clear focus, but the whole background is all blurred out. However, on the other end of that, if you close down the aperture for creative effect, you can reduce your exposure, but also you make it so that now someone's face might be fully in focus and the background behind them would also be mostly in focus or sometimes completely in focus, depending on how closed down that aperture is. Now, the tricky thing with aperture is it's typically signified by F numbers, and those F numbers usually go from something like f1.4 up to f22. Now, with aperture, the higher number, so f22, actually means the smaller the opening in your iris. And on the other end of that, if you are opened up all the way to f1.8, that means that you are wide open with your lens, meaning that the iris is open as wide as it possibly can. Some lenses are capable of much wider aperture in relation to their focal length, some not as much. Now, as you may have noticed, as we've talked about these different exposure settings, you've heard me mention that while these settings do increase or decrease how bright your image is or how much exposure you have, each one of these settings sort of has a secondary side effect. Shutter speed has the ability to increase or decrease your exposure, but also has the ability to either allow for lots of motion blur or no motion blur at all, depending on how fast you set it. Aperture, when you open that lens wide open, you are able to completely blur out the background and keep the focus only on one simple subject. Whereas if you close that iris down, you can actually get a very deep depth of focus where something up close is in focus and so is something far behind you. And then with ISO, you can go brighter or darker. With a higher number, you are obviously making your image much brighter, and with a lower number, a bit darker. The side effect with ISO is that the higher you raise that ISO, the more likely you are to introduce noise or grain into your image. Now, for those of you that are just beginning with this, and this may sound like an awful lot of information to try to take in, I've created this little cheat sheet for you. If you follow the link in the description below, it is available for you to download for free, and it's yours to use however you will. But it gives you a quick overview of what these different settings are going to do to change what your image will look like. Anyway, I hope you guys found this information helpful, and if you did, do me a favor, hit that thumbs up button, subscribe if you don't mind, it does help me out. Otherwise, download that cheat sheet, go out and take some photos, and I will see you guys in the next video.